The rope was already knotted when Eliza Talbot's horse came screaming into Cutter's Notch at a dead run, and the crowd gathered beneath the crossbeam of the feed store had to scatter or be trampled. "Cut him down!" she shouted, hauling back on the reins so hard the gelding reared and nearly threw her. "Cut him down this instant. He is innocent." Nelson Alden stood on the overturned crate with his wrists bound and the noose already settled against his throat. And for one strange, suspended moment, he looked at the woman on the lathered horse the way a drowning man looks at a rope thrown a half-second too late to matter. She was hatless, her dark hair come loose from its pins, her gray traveling dress spattered with mud to the knee, and she was holding a leather satchel over her head like a flag of truce. "Ma'am, this is a legal hanging," said Sheriff Otis grim, though his voice cracked on the word legal in a way that made several men in the crowd look at their boots. "Mr. Alden here murdered Thaddeus Whitfield in cold blood not 2 nights past, and Mr. Crane's given his word the town won't wait on some circuit judge who might not come through till first snow." "Mr. Crane's word," Eliza said, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, "is not law, Sheriff, whatever he may have paid you to believe otherwise." She pushed through the crowd, satchel clutched to her chest, and men who might have argued with a lesser voice found themselves stepping aside instead, because there was something in her bearing, something schooled and certain, that made room for itself without asking permission. "I have Thaddeus Whitfield's own hand in this bag. I have a witness who saw Nelson Alden 3 miles east of the creek at the very hour you claim. He was murdering a man he had never met. If you hang him now, you will be hanging an innocent man to save Silas Crane an inconvenient trial, and every one of you standing here will have to live the rest of your days knowing it." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Silas Crane, who had been standing near the front in a coat too fine for a town not 2 years old, did not move, but his jaw tightened in a way that Eliza, watching him closely, filed away like a lesson learned. "Mr. Alden come into this town a stranger the same night Thaddeus Whitfield died," Crane said smoothly, addressing the crowd rather than her, the way a man addresses a jury he believes he has already bought. "It is a hard thing to credit a schoolteacher's satchel over a murder weapon found in the man's own wagon. Then let us look at what is in the satchel before anyone finishes what they have started," Eliza said, and she climbed the 2 steps to the crate herself, close enough now that Nelson could see her hands were shaking even as her voice did not. Up close he was younger than she had expected from the shouting, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent 20 years handling stock and freight, sunburned and weathered, with pale eyes that studied her now with a wariness that had nothing to do with the rope around his neck. "You are welcome to hurry," he said quietly, and she realized with a small jolt that he was making a joke, or trying to, with his life balanced on a crate that any man in the crowd could kick away. "I am not in a position to enjoy suspense." "Then hold still and let me do this properly," she said, and opened the satchel. What she produced was not dramatic to look at, only a folded letter in a cramped, careful hand, and a second paper signed by a woman named Sarah Prout who kept the boarding house on First Street. She read the second one aloud first, because it was simplest. Sarah Prout swore before God and any lawman who cared to ask her again that Nelson Alden had taken supper at her table at the very hour. The sheriff claimed he was down at the creek with a knife in his hand, and that 6 other boarders had shared that table and would say the same if anyone troubled to ask them. Then she read the letter, and this one she read slowly, deliberately, so that every word would land. It was Thaddeus Whitfield's own report, written 2 days before he died, addressed to the Territorial Assay Office in Denver, stating in the plain language of a man who tested ore and water for a living that the creek feeding the town's wells carried arsenic runoff from the tailings pond above the Crane mining and milling works, in quantities that would sicken a grown man within a season and kill a child faster than that, and that he intended to file the report formally within the week regardless of what pressure had been brought to bear on him to bury it. He did not send it, Eliza said into the silence that followed. Because 2 nights ago, before he could ride to Denver, somebody put a knife in him instead, and somebody else made certain that a stranger new to town would hang for it before anybody thought to ask why a mining man like Thaddeus Whitfield, who never carried more than a pocket knife in his life, was found dead beside a hunting blade nobody in this town had ever seen before Mr. Alden's wagon arrived. The crowd was very quiet now. Somewhere behind them, a mule brayed, absurdly ordinary against the weight of what was hanging in the air. No pun intended, though later, much later, Nelson would tell her that was exactly the word he had thought at the time, hanging, and had wanted badly to laugh and had not dared to. "This is a schoolteacher's fancy," Crane said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. "A letter anyone might have written, a boarding-house woman anyone might have paid to lie." "Then let us send for the assay office in Denver and confirm the water yourselves," Eliza said, turning to face him fully now, and something in her had stopped shaking and gone very still and very hard, the way iron goes still once it has cooled. "Let us test the well behind the schoolhouse and the one behind the church, and see whether Thaddeus Whitfield told the truth in the last letter he ever wrote. If I am wrong, Mr. Crane, you may hang Nelson Alden yourself with my blessing and my apology. But if I am right, then every family in this town has been drinking poison out of your creek for a year while you sold them bottled tonic from your own mercantile to cure a sickness your own mind was causing. And I do not think you want that discussed in front of witnesses half so much as you want this rope discussed." It was Dr. Ruth Calloway, small and sharp-eyed, pushing forward from the back of the crowd, who broke the silence that followed. "I have had 11 children through my surgery this winter with bellyaches and rashes I could not account for," she said. "And old Amos Fitch's wife lost a baby not carried to term that I could not explain either. And I will test that water myself before sundown if somebody will lend me a wagon." Sheriff Grimm looked from Crane to the crowd to the rope still taut around Nelson Alden's neck, and something in the arithmetic of the moment resolved itself in a way that clearly disappointed him. "Cut him loose," he said at last hoarsely, "till we know more. Ain't nobody hanging a man on a Tuesday we might have to apologize to on a Wednesday." The rope came off. Nelson Alden's knees buckled slightly as the pressure left his throat, and it was Eliza's hand, not the sheriff's, that caught his elbow and steadied him, and he looked down at her with an expression she could not quite read, gratitude tangled up with something wary and unresolved, the look of a man who did not enjoy owing his life to anyone, least of all a stranger in a mud-hemmed dress who had ridden in like the cavalry with a satchel instead of a gun. "I am obliged to you, ma'am," he said, "though I confess I do not yet know your name." "Eliza Talbot," she said. "I teach school here, or I did until this morning when I had rather more urgent business." "Nelson Alden," he said, though of course she knew that already. Everyone in the crowd had known it for 2 days. "Wagon master when I am not standing on crates with my neck in a noose." Silas Crane had already turned and was walking away toward the mercantile with 2 of his men falling into step behind him, unhurried, a man rearranging his plans rather than a man defeated, and Eliza watched him go with a coldness settling into her stomach that told her, more clearly than any letter could, that this was not finished. That evening the town of Cutter's Notch, which 2 years before had been nothing but a mining camp of tents and one dry goods store clinging to a fold in the mountains above the old stage road, and which now boasted a school, a church, a newspaper that printed twice a month, and streets so new the boardwalk still smelled of fresh-cut pine, gathered in a way it had not gathered before, not for a hanging or a horse race or a Sunday sermon, but to wait outside Dr. Calloway's surgery for the results of a test on well water that half of them had been drinking their whole lives in that town, all 11 months of it existing. Eliza waited with them, sitting on the surgery steps with her satchel in her lap, and it was there that Nelson Alden found her, having gone first to see to his wagons and his stock, and the 11 families under his charge who were camped at the edge of town, waiting to learn whether the crossing that had nearly killed them all in the high passes had delivered them into a town worth the price. "You have not eaten," he said, by way of greeting, holding out a paper twist of jerky and biscuit he had clearly begged or bought from someone's cook fire. "A woman who rides down a hanging on an empty stomach is asking for a fainting spell, and I do not fancy catching you twice in one day." "I have not fainted in my life, Mr. Alden," she said, but she took the food anyway because she was, in fact, ravenous, having eaten nothing since breakfast the day before while she rode through the night from the Whitfield claim with the letter burning a hole in her satchel. "No," he agreed, settling onto the step beside her without asking permission, which she noted but did not object to. "I do not imagine you have. You do not strike me as a woman who does much of anything by accident. I would take that as a compliment if I did not suspect you meant it as something closer to an accusation." He was quiet a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I meant it as an observation," he said finally. "I have hauled families across 400 miles of prairie and mountain in my time, Miss Talbot, and I have learned to read people the way I read weather, because a man's temperament tells you as much about what is coming as the color of the sky. You rode into that town like you had done it 100 times before." "I have never done anything of the kind before in my life," she said, and something in her voice cracked just slightly, the first sign of the fear she had been holding down since she found Thaddeus Whitfield's body 2 mornings past, cold beside the creek with his good coat still buttoned neatly, as though he had dressed for a meeting he never got to keep. "I was terrified the entire ride, Mr. Alden. I was quite certain I would arrive to find you already dead and would have to live the rest of my life knowing I had ridden as hard as I could and it had not been hard enough." He looked at her then properly, the wariness in his pale eyes softening into something else. "Well," he said, "you did not arrive too late, and for what it is worth, ma'am, in 20 years of wagon mastering I have buried 3 men, 2 women, and 1 child I could not save no matter how hard I rode, and I have learned there is no shame in fear, only in letting it stop your hand. That is very generous, coming from a man I have known for the better part of an afternoon." "I have known you longer than that," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile now, wry and tired. "I spent a good 10 minutes of it certain you were the last face I would see on this earth. A man remembers a face under those circumstances, Miss Talbot. I expect I will remember yours a good long while." The surgery door opened before she could think of a reply that would not have betrayed how much that admission had unsettled her, and Dr. Ruth Calloway came out wiping her hands on her apron, her face grim in the lamplight. "Arsenic," she said, without preamble, to the crowd gathered in the street. "In every sample I drew from the town wells fed by that creek." Thaddeus Whitfield was telling God's own truth in that letter, and Eliza Crane's tailings pond has been leaching poison into this town's drinking water for the better part of a year, while he sold you all bottles of his own restorative tonic to treat the sickness his mind was causing. I would stake my medical license on it, and I intend to. The reaction was not what Eliza had expected. She had thought, perhaps naively, that the town would erupt at once into righteous fury, that Eliza Crane would be run out on a rail before midnight. Instead, there was a heavy, uncertain silence, because Eliza Crane owned the mill that employed 1/3 of the men present, and the mercantile that sold the only flour and salt pork for 40 miles, and the freight line that connected them to Denver, and a town that had grown faster than its own laws could keep pace with had also, in its haste, made itself entirely dependent on one man's goodwill for its survival, and everyone standing in that street understood, in the pit of their stomachs, precisely how dangerous it was to make an enemy of him. "He'll ruin every one of us," said a man Eliza recognized as the blacksmith. "He'll call in every note he's ever extended, close the mercantile to anyone who speaks against him, and there ain't a judge nearer than Denver to stop him doing it." "Then we had better make certain the judge in Denver hears of it before Eliza Crane has a chance to buy his silence too," Eliza said, and though her voice was steady, she felt, for the first time since she had ridden into town that morning, the true size of what she had started. It took 3 days for the shape of the war to become clear, and Eliza spent them teaching school in the mornings, because 11 children still needed their letters and their sums regardless of what was happening in the wider town, and spending her afternoons and evenings in company with Nelson Alden, ostensibly to help settle his wagon families into the boarding houses and half-built cabins that would serve until proper homes could go up. But in truth, because some current had been set running between them at the gallows that neither of them seemed inclined, or perhaps able, to stop. He was, she discovered, nothing like the men she had known in Boston, and nothing at all like she had expected a wagon master to be. He read, for one thing, slowly and with his lips moving faintly, a habit she found unaccountably endearing rather than the mark of ignorance she might once have assumed it to be. And when she offered, gently, to help him with a supply manifest he was puzzling over one evening, he had bristled in a way that surprised her. "I have crossed this country 9 times, Miss Talbot," he said, more sharply than the moment called for. "I do not require a schoolteacher to mind my letters for me." "I did not say you required it," she said, stung. "I offered, as one person might offer another a kindness, without any implication that you are somehow lesser for needing an extra pair of eyes on a long column of figures at the end of a hard day." "Forgive me," he said, after a moment, and had the grace to look ashamed of himself. "I have known a certain kind of educated person before, ma'am, who could not tell a wagon axle from a fence post and look down their nose at a man who could, and I am perhaps too quick to expect that from you." "I assure you I cannot tell an axle from a fence post either," she said, and something in her tone must have carried enough dryness that he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and the tension between them eased into something warmer. "No," he said, "I do not suppose you can, but you rode a horse half to death to save a stranger's neck, and read a dead man's letter aloud to a mob without your voice shaking more than a hair, and that is not nothing, Miss Talbot. I have simply never had cause to think a person could be both soft-spoken and made of iron until I met you." "I might say something similar of you, Mr. Alden," she said. "I confess I expected a wagon master to be rather more comfortable with a gun than with a Bible, and rather less troubled by the notion of an innocent stranger's death than you appeared to be at your own hanging. I have carried a Bible and a gun both across this country more times than I can count," he said. "A man learns quickly out here that he needs both, and that neither one is worth much without the other." It was, she thought later, lying awake in the small room behind the schoolhouse that served as her lodging, the first conversation of her life in which she had felt entirely, uncomfortably seen, and she was not at all certain what to do with the feeling. Silas Crane, meanwhile, was not idle. Word came through the town in the way such word always does, filtered through barkeeps and boarding housekeepers, and the wives who did the mercantile's laundry, that Crane had sent riders to Denver not to summon a judge but to buy one, or at least to buy the delay of one, and that he had begun quietly calling in debts from the families whose men worked his mill, reminding them, in the mildest possible language backed by the least mild possible implication, that a man's employment and his credit at the only store in 80 miles could be a fragile thing in a town without a bank. The circuit judge, a man named Abram Foley, was not expected for another 3 weeks at the earliest, weather and mountain passes permitting, and everyone in Cutter's Notch understood that 3 weeks was ample time for Silas Crane to arrange for every scrap of evidence against him, and possibly every witness who might speak it, to simply vanish. It was Dr. Calloway who suggested, over a supper Eliza had been invited to at the doctor's small house, that the schoolhouse might serve as the safest place to keep the accumulating evidence, since it was town property rather than Crane's, since Eliza herself had already proven she could be trusted with it, and since a schoolhouse full of children in the daylight hours was, at least in theory, the one building in town that even Silas Crane might hesitate to threaten outright. "You are asking me to turn my classroom into an arsenal," Eliza said, though she was already nodding as she said it because she could see no better alternative. "I am asking you to be brave a while longer," Dr. Calloway said. "You have already proven you have the stomach for it, Miss Talbot. I am sorry to ask more of you, but I confess I do not know who else to ask." So it was that within a week of the hanging that never was, the Cutter's Notch schoolhouse held, tucked behind a loose board beneath the lesson slate at the front of the room, Thaddeus Whitfield's original report, Dr. Calloway's own written findings on the contaminated wells, 3 separate depositions from families whose children had sickened, and a growing ledger, kept in Eliza's own careful hand, of every threat and every act of intimidation that could be laid, however indirectly, at Silas Crane's door. Nelson Alden, for his part, had not left town, though his contract as wagon master had technically ended the moment his family safely reached Cutter's Notch. When Eliza asked him, somewhat too casually, whether he intended to move on with the next outbound train as most freighters did, he had looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I have spent 20 years crossing this country and never once staying anywhere long enough to plant a fence post," he said. "I find this particular spring that I am in less of a hurry than usual to leave." "And why is that, Mr. Alden?" she asked, though she suspected, from the sudden warmth climbing her own throat, that she already knew the answer and was only fishing for the pleasure of hearing him say it. "I expect you know why, Miss Talbot," he said. "Same as I expect you have some notion of why a schoolteacher who could have quietly handed her evidence to the sheriff and gone back to her lesson books instead rode straight into a mob to stop a hanging she had no obligation to stop." "I had every obligation," she said. "A man's life was at stake. A man's life was at stake in a town you had lived in less than a year, over a stranger you had never met," he said. "That is not obligation, Eliza. That is character. And I would be a poor liar if I told you I had not thought of little else since." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed in her chest with a warmth that startled her with its intensity. And for a moment neither of them said anything further, the silence between them charged with everything neither was quite ready to name. The land baron's first true move against them came not against the schoolhouse directly, but against the wagon families camped at its edge, still waiting for lumber and lots to build their promised homes. Crane's foreman, a broad, sun-blackened man named Jack Deal who had a reputation for settling disputes with his fists before his words, arrived at the camp one gray morning with 4 riders, and a paper claiming that the ground the families had settled on, ground Nelson himself had scouted and secured with the town clerk's blessing before the crossing had even begun, in fact belonged to the Crane Mining and Milling Company by an older, unrecorded claim. "You will need to move your wagons," Deal said, not dismounting, "or Mr. Crane will be forced to have them moved for you." "I have a filing with the town clerk not 2 weeks old," Nelson said, standing his ground in front of the nearest wagon, arms crossed. "And you have a paper I have never seen before with a signature I do not recognize. I do not believe you, Mr. Deal, and I do not believe your employer either, and I would ask you kindly to take your horses and your paper back to town before someone here loses patience with both." "There are 11 families here," Deal said, with the particular smile of a man who enjoys being disliked. "Women, children. It would be a shame if a fire started in this camp some cold night when there weren't enough hands to fight it." It was not quite a threat spoken aloud, but it did not need to be, and Nelson understood it exactly as it was meant, and so, later, did Eliza when he came to find her at the schoolhouse at the end of the day, his jaw tight with a fury he was working hard to keep banked. "He is threatening to burn them out," Nelson said. "I have seen that look on a man's face before, Eliza. He was not bluffing." "Then we go to the town clerk today, this hour, and confirm your filing in writing with witnesses," she said, already reaching for her shawl. "And we make certain word of Deal's threat reaches every ear in this town before nightfall, because a man like Crane depends on fear working in the dark. He cannot afford for it to work in the light." They went together, and the town clerk, a nervous young man named Prout who happened to be the nephew of the very Sarah Prout whose testimony had saved Nelson's life, confirmed the filing was sound and Crane's claim baseless. And by evening the story of Jack Deal's threat against 11 families with children had spread through Cutters Notch in the particular way that shame spreads through a town too young to have grown a thick skin against it yet. But Silas Crane, it turned out, was not a man who retreated simply because one gambit had failed. He was, Eliza was beginning to understand, a man who adjusted, patiently, the way water finds a new course around a stone, and his next move came not as an open threat but as something far more insidious. 10 days after the hanging that never was, the town of Cutters Notch woke to find a notice nailed to the door of the schoolhouse, the mercantile, and the assay office alike, announcing that the schoolhouse building itself sat on ground originally platted for a company warehouse, that the Crane Mining and Milling Company was reclaiming the parcel effective immediately for urgent business purposes, and that the schoolteacher and her pupils would need to vacate within 3 days. Eliza read the notice with her hands shaking, not from fear this time but from a pure, clean fury she had rarely felt in her life. It was not truly about the building, she understood at once. It was about the evidence hidden beneath the lesson slate, and about breaking her, publicly and legally, before she could do the same to him. "He cannot simply take a schoolhouse," she said to Nelson, who had come at a run the moment he heard. "He can try," Nelson said grimly. "And if the town clerk's records are half so tangled as I suspect, given how fast this place threw itself up, he may even have some scrap of paper to back the claim, same as he tried with my family's land. But Eliza, listen to me. If he sends men to clear that building, they will not be gentle about it, and they will not care whether the evidence you have hidden burns along with the rest of the slate boards. Then I will not let them clear it," she said. "Eliza, I mean it, Nelson. I have 11 children whose education has already been interrupted once by a hanging that should never have happened, and I will not have their schoolhouse seized to hide a poisoned well. If Silas Crane wants that building, he will have to come and take it from me himself, in front of the whole town, in the daylight, where every soul in Cutters Notch can see exactly what kind of man he is." Nelson looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and proud and frightened all tangled together in his expression. "You cannot fight armed men with a slate and a lesson book," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I have a bell, Mr. Alden, and I have found in recent weeks that I have rather more nerve than I once gave myself credit for. I believe that will have to serve." 3 days later, on a cold, bright morning with the last of the winter's heavy snowpack still gleaming on the peaks above town, threatening its own slow violence in the avalanche chutes that every old-timer in Cutters Notch watched nervously each spring, Jack Deal rode up to the schoolhouse with 6 armed men behind him, and a wagon meant to haul away its contents. Eliza was waiting for them on the schoolhouse steps. She had sent the children home an hour before, over their tearful protests, with strict instructions to run straight to their mothers and not to look back, and she had positioned herself squarely in the doorway with the heavy brass hand bell she used each morning to call her pupils in from recess held in both hands. And though her heart was hammering so hard she feared Deal might hear it from horseback, her voice, when it came, did not waver. "This is town property, Mr. Deal," she said, "held for the education of this town's children under a filing older than any claim Mr. Crane can produce. You have no lawful business here. Mr. Crane's business is not yours to judge, ma'am," Deal said, swinging down from his horse with the easy contempt of a man who has never once been stopped by a woman's voice alone. "Step aside, or we will move you aside." "You may try," Eliza said, and lifted the bell and rang it, hard, 3 long peals that cracked across the cold morning air and rolled down the length of the main street like an alarm, which was, of course, precisely what it was. Deal's men hesitated, glancing at one another, because there is something in the sound of a bell rung in genuine crisis that unsettles even hardened men, a sound built into the memory of every soul raised anywhere near a church or a fire watch, a sound that says something is happening, come and see, And within moments doors up and down the street were opening, faces appearing in windows, men stepping out of the mercantile and the blacksmith's shop and the saloon to see what the ringing meant. "Ring that bell again," Deal said, low and dangerous, "and I will take it from you myself. Then you will have to explain to every person now watching from that street why 6 armed men found it necessary to wrestle a bell away from a schoolteacher standing on her own schoolhouse steps," Eliza said, and rang it again louder longer, her arms already aching, sweat cold on her back despite the mountain chill, every instinct in her screaming to run, and every ounce of will she possessed holding her exactly where she stood. "I am not moving, Mr. Deal. This building holds nothing of interest to Mr. Crane's business, except what he is afraid the town will learn, and I would rather you drag me off these steps in front of every witness in Cutter's Notch than hand it over quietly." The street was filling now. The blacksmith still in his apron, Sarah Prout from the boarding house, a broom still in her hand, Dr. Calloway moving fast, her medical bag left behind in her haste, and behind them, drawn by the same ringing bell, families from the wagon camp, men who had crossed 400 miles of prairie and mountain under Nelson Alden's care, and had learned in that crossing exactly what it looked like when a person refused to break. "Mr. Deal," Eliza said, her voice pitched now to carry to the gathering crowd as much as to the man in front of her, "you may tell Mr. Crane that if he wishes to seize this schoolhouse, he is welcome to walk down this street himself and explain to these good people, in the daylight, precisely why he wants it so badly. I expect he does not care to answer that question in front of witnesses. I expect that is why he sent you instead." Deal's jaw worked. He glanced back at the gathering crowd, larger now by the second, glanced at his own men, whose enthusiasm for manhandling a schoolteacher off her own steps in front of half the town was visibly cooling, and then from down the street came the sound Eliza had been praying for since she rang that first peal. Hoofbeats, several sets, moving fast. Nelson Alden arrived with 4 of the wagon family's men behind him, none of them carrying weapons drawn, all of them simply present, a wall of bodies drawing up between the crowd and Deal's riders, and Nelson himself dismounted and walked straight up the schoolhouse steps to stand beside Eliza, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, close enough that she could feel him trembling slightly with the same fury she had been fighting to master for the last 5 minutes. "You heard the lady," Nelson said, and though his voice was quiet it carried the particular authority of a man 20 years, used to being obeyed by frightened people in dangerous country. "This schoolhouse is not for the taking, Mr. Deal. Not today, not tomorrow, not while there is a soul in this town willing to stand behind her, and from where I am standing that looks to be most of it." Deal looked from Nelson to Eliza to the crowd, weighing, calculating, and whatever arithmetic he performed came out against him, because after a long, taut moment he spat into the dirt, remounted, and turned his horse. "This ain't finished," he said. "No," Eliza agreed, lowering the bell at last, her arms shaking now that the danger had passed enough to let them. "I do not imagine it is." The crowd did not disperse quickly. They stood in the street a long while, talking in low, urgent voices, and Eliza understood, watching them, that something had shifted in the town that morning, something that Silas Crane's money and his mercantile credit could not easily buy back. A schoolteacher had stood alone against 6 armed men with nothing but a bell and her own refusal to move, and the whole town had seen it, and a town that had been afraid to speak against Crane in the safety of Dr. Calloway's surgery 3 weeks before was, this morning, standing shoulder to shoulder in the open street. "You are shaking," Nelson said quietly, once the street had mostly cleared and only Dr. Calloway remained nearby, fussing over Eliza's hands as though checking for injury. "I have never been so frightened in my life," Eliza admitted, and found to her own surprise that she was laughing, a slightly hysterical edge to it, the laughter of a person who has survived something she was not certain she would survive. "You did not look frightened," Nelson said. "You looked like you had been born to stand on those steps." "I did not feel born to it." I felt entirely certain I was about to be dragged off by my hair, and that this whole gesture would look, in hindsight, like the height of foolishness. "It was not foolishness," he said, and reached out hesitantly to steady her still trembling hands in his own, a gesture that felt, in the aftermath of everything, entirely natural, as though their hands had been waiting weeks for the excuse. "It was the bravest thing I have seen a person do in 20 years on this road, Eliza, and I have seen men face down grizzly bears and river crossings that took wagons whole. I do not know how to tell you what it did to me, watching you stand there." "You may try," she said, softer now, her heart doing something complicated that had nothing at all to do with fear of Jack Deal. "It made me understand," he said slowly, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation he brought to reading a supply manifest, "that I have spent 20 years thinking a person's strength was something you could see in the width of their shoulders or the calluses on their hands, and that I have been wrong about that for a very long time, and that I would very much like, if you would permit it, to spend a good deal more time in your company finding out what else I have been wrong about." Eliza felt the warmth climb from her chest into her throat and settle, unmistakably, into a smile she did not try to hide. "I believe I would permit that, Mr. Alden," she said. "Though I would remind you that a woman does not fall in love with a man merely because he arrived on time to a standoff." "No," he agreed, and there was that ghost of a smile again, warmer now, less wary. "I imagine she falls in love with him for considerably better reasons than that. I am content to spend some time discovering what those might be." That evening, over a supper, Dr. Calloway insisted on hosting for what she called the victors of the schoolhouse siege. Though nothing had truly been won so much as delayed, talk turned inevitably to what Silas Crane's next move might be, and it was old Amos Fitch, whose wife had lost the child doctor. Calloway could not explain, who voiced what everyone at the table was thinking. "He will not come at us in daylight again," Fitch said. "Not after what happened this morning. A man like Crane does not lose a fight in front of witnesses twice." "Then he will come in the dark," Nelson said grimly, "and he will not send Deal with a piece of paper next time." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain evening settling outside the windows. "The evidence," she said. "If he cannot take the schoolhouse by daylight claim, he may try to destroy what is inside it, and the wagon camp besides, by whatever means are quickest and hardest to trace back to him." "Fire, Doctor," Calloway said quietly, and the word sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. It was, everyone at that table understood without needing to say it further, the oldest and cruelest weapon available to a desperate man in a mountain town, built entirely of new, dry pine, surrounded on every side by timber that had not yet felt a spring rain, in a season when the snowpack above had been unusually heavy and unusually late to melt, leaving the ground below deceptively dry, even as the peaks still gleamed white, the runoff not yet come to soak the valley floor. The wind through the high passes sharp and constant, and utterly indifferent to what it might carry. They did not have long to wait to learn they were right. It was 3 nights later, well past midnight, when Eliza woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of screaming horses. She was out of her bed and into her boots before she had fully understood what had woken her, and when she threw open the door of her small room behind the schoolhouse, the sky to the east over the wagon camp was lit an angry, flickering orange, and the wind, which had been picking up steadily since sundown, was carrying sparks and the smell of burning pine straight toward the heart of town. She ran. She did not stop to think, did not stop to reason through what she might do against a fire already large enough to light the underside of the clouds, only ran toward the camp with her heart in her throat, praying with every step that the children she taught each morning were not still asleep in the path of it. The scene that met her at the camp was chaos given shape. One of the supply wagons, the one that had carried, among its ordinary freight, several crates of the family's spare grain and the duplicate copies of depositions Eliza herself had insisted be kept there as backup in case the schoolhouse copies were ever seized, was fully engulfed, flames leaping 20 feet into the night sky, and the wind, cruel and constant, was carrying burning debris toward the dry brush at the edge of the camp, toward the tents and the picketed horses, who screamed and fought their ropes in a terror that was, Eliza understood in one horrified glance, entirely justified. Nelson was already there, shirtless, having clearly run from his own bedroll the moment the smell woke him, shouting orders in a voice honed by 20 years of managing exactly this kind of crisis on the trail, though never, she suspected, one quite this deliberately set. Cut the horses loose from the picket line. Do not try to lead them. They will drag you. Just cut them free and let them run clear of the smoke. He bellowed, and men were moving fast, knives out, and terrified horses were bolting past Eliza in the dark, close enough that she felt the wind of their passing, close enough that one grazed her shoulder hard enough to spin her half around. The children! She shouted, finding him through the smoke and chaos. Nelson, where are the families? Are the children clear? The Hutchins tent is on the wrong side of the wind line, he shouted back, already moving toward it, and she ran with him, coughing now as the smoke thickened, her eyes streaming. The roar of the fire behind them like a living thing, hungry and fast, faster than either of them had accounted for. The wind driving it through dry brush that had had no spring rain to slow it, embers leaping ahead of the main blaze to catch new fuel yards away in a way that made the whole camp feel, within minutes, surrounded rather than merely threatened. They reached the Hutchins tent to find the mother, a thin, exhausted woman named Grace Hutchins, trying desperately to wake her youngest, a boy of 6 named Tommy who was one of Eliza's own pupils, while her older children clung to her skirts, coughing and crying. He will not wake. He sleeps so deep, oh God, Nelson, the smoke. Nelson was already inside the tent, scooping the boy up against his chest, and Eliza took the older children's hands, one in each of her own, and together they half ran, half stumbled clear of the tent line just as a wall of flame, driven by a fresh gust of that relentless spring wind, swept through the very space they had occupied moments before, so close that Eliza felt the heat of it scorch across her back like a physical blow. "This whole camp will go," Nelson shouted, once they had put enough distance between themselves and the fire line to catch a full breath. "Eliza, we cannot fight this, not with the wind like this. We have to move everyone now toward the creek. It is the only clear ground wide enough to hold against the flame." "The evidence," Eliza gasped, coughing smoke from her lungs, thinking with sudden horror of the duplicate depositions burning in that wagon, of the schoolhouse itself, dry pine, half a mile downwind of a fire this size, with the original documents still hidden beneath the lesson slate. "The schoolhouse," Nelson said, understanding instantly, his face grim in the flickering light. "Eliza, if this wind holds, that fire will reach the edge of town within the hour." "Then we ring the bell," Eliza said, already turning, already running back toward the schoolhouse even as every instinct screamed at her to run the opposite direction, toward safety, toward the creek where Nelson was already herding families and terrified, wild-eyed horses. "Nelson, the whole town needs waking, not just the camp. If this reaches the buildings we will lose everything. Get the families to the creek. I will raise the alarm and save what I can from the schoolhouse and meet you there." "Eliza, no, it is too dangerous alone. There is no time to argue it." She shouted back, already running, and he stood torn for one agonized second, the boy Tommy still cradled against his chest, coughing, before Grace Hutchins pulled at his arm. "Go with her. I have my children. Get her to safety and come back for the rest of us, please, Mr. Alden. We cannot lose her too." He handed Tommy to his mother and ran after Eliza, catching up to her just as she reached the schoolhouse steps, both of them gasping for breath that came harder now with the smoke thick in the air even this far from the flame front. She did not hesitate at the door. She went straight for the bell, the same brass hand bell she had rung against Jack Deal not 4 days before, and this time she rang it not to hold a line but to raise one, running out into the street even as she rang it, the peals wild and continuous now. a sound utterly unlike the measured calling in of children to their lessons, a sound that said unmistakably to every sleeping soul in Cutter's Notch, "Wake now, wake now. The mountain is burning and the wind will not wait for you to dress." Windows lit. Doors flew open. Men ran into the street in nightshirts and boots, and within minutes the whole town had caught the scent of smoke on the wind and needed no further convincing. And Cutter's Notch, a town that had been divided and afraid and cowed by one man's money for weeks, came together in the space of that single terrible hour with a unity that no town meeting could have manufactured. Nelson went inside the schoolhouse with her, and together, working fast in the dim light of a single lamp, they pried up the lesson slate and gathered the hidden evidence into Eliza's satchel. Every letter, every deposition, every page of Dr. Calloway's careful notes, while outside the bucket lines were already forming down to the creek, men and women passing water hand to hand in the desperate, ancient rhythm of a town fighting for its own survival. "We cannot save the building if the wind does not turn," Nelson said, as they emerged back into the street, satchel secured, the schoolhouse itself now standing directly in the path the fire seemed determined to take, embers already visible in the sky above its roof. "Then we save what matters most and let the wood be wood," Eliza said, though her voice caught on the words, because that schoolhouse had been the first place in Cutter's Notch that had ever felt entirely her own, the place where she had built something of value with her own 2 hands out of nothing but chalk and patience and 11 children's trust. It was, in the end, the wind itself that saved them, turning with the capriciousness of mountain weather just as the fire line reached the outer edge of town, sweeping the flame back toward the already burned camp, rather than pushing it onward into the heart of Cutter's Notch. And by the gray light of dawn, exhausted men and women stood coughing in streets thick with drifting ash, watching the last of the flames die back into smoldering black ruin across what had, hours before, been a wagon camp full of families' hopes. The schoolhouse stood, scorched along one wall, its paint blistered but standing. The wagon camp was not so fortunate. 3 wagons were lost entirely, along with much of the family's remaining grain and goods, though by some mercy no lives had been taken, no person burned worse than blistered hands and smoke-stung eyes, a mercy that everyone present understood in the grim light of morning could easily have gone the other way. Nelson found Eliza sitting on the schoolhouse steps as the sun came fully up, her face streaked with soot and dried tears she had not realized she'd shed, the satchel of evidence still clutched in her lap as though she had not been able to make herself let it go even now that the danger had passed. "You are hurt," he said, seeing the scorch mark along the shoulder of her nightdress where the flame had come close enough to singe the fabric during their run from the Hutchins tent. "It is nothing," she said. "A burn no worse than sunburn. I will live, Nelson." He sat beside her heavily, exhaustion and something rower than exhaustion written into every line of him. "I have led wagon trains through Indian country and river floods and one blizzard that took 2 men I could not save," he said, "and I have never in my life been as afraid as I was tonight, watching you run back toward that schoolhouse alone." "I was not entirely alone," she said softly. "You came after me." "I will always come after you," he said, and the words landed between them with a weight that neither of them tried to laugh away this time. "Eliza, I do not know how to say this properly. I have never had cause to learn the words for it, but I have spent 20 years of my life moving from one place to the next because I never found a reason worth the trouble of staying. And I find, watching you stand against a mob and then run back into a burning schoolhouse for a satchel of papers that might save this whole town, that I have finally found one. Nelson, let me finish, please, before my nerve fails me the way it has never failed me on any trail I have crossed." He turned to face her fully, taking her soot-streaked hands in his own scarred ones. "I do not care that you can read Latin and I struggle over a supply manifest. I do not care that you came from Boston and I have never been east of the Mississippi in my life. I have watched you stand against armed men with nothing but a bell, and I have watched you run into fire for the sake of children who are not your own blood, and I have come to understand that whatever I thought made a person strong, I was wrong about it, and that I have fallen in love with you somewhere between that hanging and this dawn, and I do not intend to keep moving on from this town or from you, if you will have me stay." Eliza felt the tears come again, though these were of an entirely different character than the ones the smoke had wrung from her hours before. "I have spent my whole life being told that an educated woman was a delicate thing, unsuited for a life beyond a parlor and a schoolroom," she said, her voice thick. "I came west, in part, to prove that wrong to myself as much as to anyone else, and I did not expect in proving it to find a man who would look at my strength and love it rather than fear it. Yes, Nelson Alden, I will have you stay. I would have you stay even if this town burned to the last board tonight, because I have come to understand, somewhere between that hanging and this dawn myself, that home is not a building. It is a person who runs toward the fire beside you rather than away from it." He kissed her then, there on the scorched schoolhouse steps in the gray light of a Colorado dawn, with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, and the whole exhausted town moving slowly around them. And it was not a kiss born of drama or desperation, but something steadier, something that felt, to both of them, remarkably like the first solid ground either had stood on in a very long time. But the fire, terrible as it had not been an accident, and everyone in Cutter's Notch understood by mid-morning, once the ash had settled enough for men to examine the burned ground, exactly what had started it. A trail of coal oil, half-burned but unmistakable in its pattern, led from the edge of the camp toward the road that ran back toward the Crane mining and milling works, and a boot print, deep and fresh in the mud near where the trail began, matched, when Sheriff Grimm was finally shamed into comparing it, a print left in the soft earth outside the schoolhouse the morning Jack Deal had come to seize it. "This is enough for a warrant, Doctor," Calloway said, when the town gathered that afternoon in the half-burned street to take stock of what had happened and what must happen next. "Arson, attempted destruction of evidence in a matter of contaminated water endangering the whole town, and very likely murder as well, once Judge Foley arrives and can properly weigh Thaddeus Whitfield's death against it." "Crane will not simply hand himself over for a warrant," Nelson said grimly. "Not a man like that cornered." He was right. Word came within the hour that Silas Crane had barricaded himself and several armed men, Jack Deal among them, inside the mill office at the Crane Works, and that he had sent a rider to Denver, not for a judge this time but for hired guns, men who would arrive. If the rider rode hard within 3 or 4 days, ample time, everyone understood, for Crane to either flee the territory entirely with whatever he could carry, or to make one final, desperate attempt to silence the evidence and the witnesses against him before the law could formally arrive. "We cannot wait 3 or 4 days not knowing which," Eliza said. "Judge Foley is expected within the week regardless. If we can hold this town together, keep the evidence safe, and keep Crane contained until Foley arrives with proper authority, we win this without another shot fired or another fire set. If we panic or scatter, or let fear divide us the way it did before the schoolhouse standoff, he will find the cracks and use them." It was Nelson who organized the town's defense in the days that followed, drawing on 20 years of experience keeping frightened, vulnerable groups of people safe across dangerous country, setting watches along the road from the mill works, arranging for the families whose wagons had burned to be housed among the town's existing residents rather than left exposed at the camp's edge, and ensuring that the evidence, now guarded around the clock by rotating pairs of armed townsmen, never sat unwatched for even an hour. Eliza, for her part, did something that surprised even herself. She reopened the schoolhouse the very next morning, scorched wall and all, and taught her lessons as though nothing at all had happened, because she understood, with an instinct that ran deeper than strategy, That a town watching its schoolteacher calmly teach arithmetic to 11 children the morning after a fire and a standoff was a town reassured, in its bones, that the center would hold. Parents who might otherwise have kept their children home out of fear instead sent them, because Eliza Talbot, standing at her chalkboard, steady and unafraid, had become, in the space of a few short weeks, something like a promise the whole town had made to itself. Judge Abram Foley arrived on the 6th day, 5 days ahead of the hired guns Crane had sent for, having been summoned not by Crane's men in Denver, but by a writer Nelson had sent the very morning after the fire. And his arrival, weathered and stern and entirely unimpressed by Silas Crane's reputation or his money, changed the calculus of the entire standoff in an afternoon. The public hearing was held not in a courtroom, for Cutter's Notch had none, but in the street itself in front of the Mercantile, because Judge Foley declared that a matter concerning the whole town's water and the whole town's safety ought to be settled where the whole town could see it settled. In the daylight, the same daylight Eliza had insisted upon weeks before on the schoolhouse steps. Silas Crane came, in the end, not because he wished to, but because Judge Foley made plain that a refusal to appear would be taken, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, as an admission of guilt sufficient to warrant his arrest on the spot, and a man who had built his fortune on careful appearances could not stomach that particular verdict being rendered against him in front of the entire town without at least attempting to argue his case. Eliza stood before the makeshift bench with her satchel, now considerably thicker with weeks of accumulated evidence, and read aloud once more, as she had at the gallows, Thaddeus Whitfield's letter, and then Dr. Calloway's findings, and then the depositions of sickened families, and finally the arson evidence tying the fire directly to Crane's own Mill Road, while Nelson stood at her shoulder throughout, not speaking, because this was not his fight to argue, but present, solid, unmistakably beside her, in a way that the whole town understood without needing it explained. "You cannot prove I ordered any of this," Crane said, when his turn came, his composure fraying visibly under Judge Foley's flat, unimpressed stare. "Jack Deal acted on his own initiative in matters of the fire and the schoolhouse both. I am a businessman, Your Honor, not an arsonist." "A businessman," Judge Foley said dryly, "who knew for the better part of a year, by his own Assier's written word, that his mill's tailings were poisoning this town's water, and who sold that same town bottled tonic to treat the sickness his silence caused, and whose foreman's boot prints sit in the mud beside a coal-oil trail leading directly to his own Mill Road. I have tried men on considerably thinner evidence than this, Mr. Crane, and hanged some of them besides, though I do not intend to hang you, because this town has had quite enough of hangings for one spring, and because a jury in Denver will do that work more properly than I care to do it in a dusty street. You will be held for trial on charges of criminal negligence causing death and injury, conspiracy to obstruct justice and accessory to arson, and Jack Deal, wherever he has run off to, will be found and charged besides." It was not, in the end, the dramatic gunfight that a lesser story might have demanded. Jack Deal was found 2 days later, hiding in a line shack 10 miles up the valley, and surrendered without a shot fired, once he understood his employer had already been taken into custody and had no further use or protection to offer him. Crane's hired guns, arriving from Denver 5 days after the hearing, found the matter already settled, and a circuit judge's authority already firmly established, and turned around and rode back the way they had come, their fee, presumably, unpaid, since the man who had sent for them was by then residing in the town's newly reinforced jail cell awaiting transport to face proper trial. The town of Cutter's Notch, in the weeks that followed, set about the considerable business of rebuilding, both in the literal sense of new wells dug well clear of the poisoned creek, and a new mill superintendent brought in to run the works honestly under a court-appointed trustee, and in the quieter sense of a community learning, for the first time since its hasty founding, what it meant to govern itself with something like actual law rather than one wealthy man's whims. A town council was formed. A proper well inspector was hired, paid from mill profits now overseen by the court. Dr. Calloway was given funds to expand her surgery. And the schoolhouse, scorched wall repaired with fresh-cut pine that still smelled faintly of sap on warm afternoons, was given a proper bell tower to replace the hand bell Eliza had carried through two of the most frightening days of her life. A bell tower the town insisted on building themselves, unasked, as a kind of thanks that no one quite knew how to put into plainer words. Nelson Alden did not return to wagon mastering that season, nor the season after. He took instead what remained of his freighting equipment and his considerable experience with stock and supply, and set about building, alongside the families he had guided across the mountains, a proper freight depot at the edge of town, one that would serve cutters not honestly as the mine traffic grew and the eventual railroad, everyone understood, would someday reach these mountains and change the town again in ways none of them could yet foresee. He built it on a plot of land adjoining the schoolhouse, a fact that surprised no one in town, least of all Eliza, who had by midsummer taken to spending her evenings on the depot's half-finished porch, watching Nelson work with the particular quiet pleasure of a woman watching a man build something meant to last, rather than something meant merely to be crossed and left behind. "You have never built anything permanent in your life," she said to him one evening in early autumn, as he set the last board of the depot's front porch railing, "and yet you have taken to it as though you were born to a hammer rather than a wagon whip." "I have decided," he said, testing the railing's strength with both hands before straightening, "that there is more to building a life than crossing distance quickly, Eliza. I spent 20 years measuring my worth in miles covered and families delivered safely to wherever they were bound. I find I would rather measure it now in something that stays put, in a porch a person can sit on, in a schoolhouse bell a whole town knows the sound of, in a home. A home built by a man who spent 20 years running from the very idea of one," she said, coming to sit on the porch step beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, the mountain evening cooling around them in the particular golden light of a Colorado September. "A home built by a man who finally found the one thing worth staying for," he corrected gently, and took her hand. "Eliza, I have asked you a great many things this past season, some of them foolish, most of them born of fear I did not know how to name properly. I would like to ask you one more thing now if you will permit it, and I would like to ask it properly this time, without a rope around my neck or a fire at my back to rush the words out of me." She felt her breath catch, though she had in truth been waiting for this moment for weeks, watching it approach the way one watches whether building over the mountains, certain and welcome both. "Ask it then," she said softly. "Eliza Talbot," he said, "I have crossed 400 miles of prairie and mountain more times than I can properly count, and I have never once in all those crossings found anything worth staying still for, until a schoolteacher with more nerve than sense rode into a hanging and changed the whole shape of my life in one afternoon. I love you. I love your courage and your stubbornness, and the way you read a lesson to 11 children with the same fierce care you brought to reading a dead man's letter to a mob. I would like to build the rest of my life on this porch, beside your schoolhouse with you, if you will consent to marry me." "Yes," she said, before he had even fully finished the sentence, laughing through sudden tears, the same fierce joy rising in her chest that she had felt standing on the schoolhouse steps with a bell in her hands, refusing to move. "Yes, Nelson Alden, I will marry you, though I would remind you that I intend to keep teaching school after, bell tower and all, and I will not be talked out of it by any husband, however dear." "I would not dream of talking you out of it," he said, pulling her close, his voice rough with feeling. "I fell in love with the woman who would not move off those steps, Eliza. I have no wish to marry anyone less than her." They were married the following month in the schoolhouse itself, with the whole town in attendance, Dr. Calloway standing as Eliza's witness and old Amos Fitch, whose family had been among the first Nelson ever guided west, standing as Nelsons. And when the new minister, brought in that same season along with the town's growing list of proper institutions, pronounced them husband and wife, it was the schoolhouse bell, rung by Tommy Hutchins himself, grinning ear to ear, that announced the news to the whole valley. The same bell that had once rung out a warning against armed men, and a wildfire, both now ringing, clear and bright, in simple celebration. By the time the first snows of the following winter dusted the peaks above Cutter's Notch, gentler that year than the heavy, dangerous fall that had nearly buried the passes the spring before, the freight depot stood finished beside the schoolhouse, a modest sign painted above its door reading Alden Freight and Supply, and Eliza had taken to keeping the depot's ledgers herself in the evenings, finding, to Nelson's very great amusement and no small pride, that a schoolteacher's careful hand, with figures made for an excellent bookkeeper besides. "I believe," he told her once, watching her work by lamplight at the depot's front desk, the schoolhouse bell tower visible through the window beyond her shoulder, silhouetted against the last of a mountain sunset, that I have built myself a rather better life than I ever managed to imagine on any trail I crossed. "I believe," Eliza said, not looking up from the ledger, though the smile on her face was answer enough, "that we built it together, Mr. Alden, same as everything worth having in this life generally turns out to be built." And in the town of Cutter's Notch, where the water now ran clean from wells dug well clear of any tailings pond, where a court-appointed trustee ran the mill honestly, and a proper council governed what one man's money had once controlled outright, the schoolhouse bell rang each morning to call children to their lessons, and every soul in town who heard it remembered, whether they said so aloud or not, the spring a schoolteacher had stood alone on her own front steps against armed men and had not moved, and the wagon master who had come running when she needed him most, and the love that had grown, steady and sure as new timber taking root, between them both.